All right, so we talked about this idea of whether you do fast training or whether you do slow training, doesn't really matter. Both of them are going to increase your endurance capacity. So then what should you do? Should you do one? Should you do the other? Should you do a combination of both of them? And the reality is you should do a combination of both of them. And this is a really nice study that came out of Scotland. And basically what they did is they did polarized training. And what that is when you take 80% of your training is slow, long, slow distance. 20% of your training is high intensity intervals. And you compare that to people who did what's called threshold training. And threshold training is that it's kind of what we all do. We go out and we run hard, but we don't run really hard, but we don't run slow. We run where we feel like it's hard, but not so hard that we're out of breath. So we're running faster than a slow run, but not as fast as a high intensity interval. So we run in this middle ground, and that's kind of where we all find ourselves, is that we're all running in this middle ground. So let's look at see what happens. If you run 80% of your exercise, and this is cycling, I believe they did here. They did 80% of their exercise at a low, slow rate, and then they did 20% of their exercise at a really high intensity. And then they looked at their time to fatigue or their performance measures. You can see there's this really nice increase in endurance capacity. Okay, so they get almost a 70% increase in endurance capacity over the period of training. Now, if instead you kind of go moderately hard all the time, so not really, so you're going instead of, so the fast here, this is probably above 85% of VO2 max. And the lactate threshold training is about 65 to 70% of VO2 max. So you're going a lot faster in this 20% fast in the polarized training than you are in the lactate threshold training. The lactate threshold training is going moderately fast. So it's just right above, a little bit above easy talking speed. So you can't really talk very comfortably at that speed. But you can see that when you do it moderate training, but you do more of that moderate high intensity training or moderate intensity training, you get this moderate effect where, yeah, you improve endurance, but it's not nearly as much. It's half as much as you got if you were to do a lot of long, slow distance and then a little bit of really fast work. And so what we're talking about here is just 20% of the work is done at a very high intensity, above 85% of VO2 max. So this is when we're talking about doing different either sprint intervals or high intensity intervals. Let me explain what I mean by that. So if we look at our different, remember back to the energetics component, when we look at the different ways that we're making energy, and we talked about this idea of there's different times here. So if we look at this stored ATP and phosphocreatine line, and you look at that stored ATP and phosphocreatine line, you can produce energy really quickly for a sprint. And that sprint is going to last, that energy is going to last maybe 30 seconds. And that's when you see this transition between the stored ATP and phosphocreatine and glycolytic energy production. But at this transition between these two, now you're in between two different energy sources. So you've got a little bit from both, but you're at that switch. And that's where it's like, you guys probably have never driven a manual transmission car, but you get into a race and you'd be accelerating in your manual transmission, you would put in the clutch, that would disengage the engine, and you would shift gears. And at that time, that's kind of where you are here. You're shifting gears. And at that time, now your engine is revving really high, but because you've got the clutch in, you're not getting much output. And so you're actually using energy faster than you can produce it. The same thing happens here when we get out to this around 2-minute transition, because at about 2 minutes, now we're shifting from glycolysis to aerobic energy or oxidative energy production. And what we find is the best times to do interval training are this 30-second-ish period here and the 2 to 4 minute period here where we're transitioning from glycolytic to oxidative. The third area that we go is the long, slow distance. and that's out here where it's completely oxidative and we're going at a long, slow distance. So when we're talking about intervals, what we're talking about is we're talking about short sprint intervals that last between 10 seconds and 30 seconds. We're talking about high intensity intervals that last from 2 minutes to 4 minutes. And then we're talking about long, slow distance that lasts 30 minutes or greater. And so now these are the time frames that we're really looking to train in. We want to train sprint intervals, 10 to 30 seconds, high intensity intervals, 2 to 4 minutes, and then long, slow distance, greater than 30 minutes. All right? So how would you start to do this? If you're starting, you've never done any endurance training before, say now you're stuck at home, you happen to have a stationary bike, or you happen to be able to go out and run, or you happen to have a rowing machine, or you happen to have a swimming pool. How do you set this up? How do you set up the training program? Remember, we're talking frequency, intensity, duration, and then progression. All right? Frequency, how much, what you're talking about there is how many times a week. In order to determine that is how much mechanical fatigue is in your exercise. So if you're on a bike, a training bike, there's very little mechanical fatigue. There's a lot of metabolic fatigue, but it's not very much mechanical fatigue because the impact force is dissipated. If you're swimming, again, not much mechanical fatigue. If you're rowing on that rowing machine, very little mechanical fatigue. So your frequency can be higher in those things. If you're going out for a run, now 3 times your body weight's hitting the ground every time. So that means there's more mechanical fatigue. That means your frequency has to be less. How quickly do you recover is the second thing. If you've been training a lot, or if you know that you don't get sore, you don't need a lot of rest, you can train more frequently. Okay? The second thing is, how intense do you want to go? So what here is the key is, what's your goal? If your goal is to perform at a high level, now you're going to have to do 20% at a really high intensity. If your goal is to be healthy, you don't have to increase the intensity that much. And the duration, basically, you're going to look back at the frequency intensity, and now you're going to say, how long can I do this for? If I'm going to go at a high intensity, my durations are going to be, maybe you're going to start with how many intervals you're going to do. So 4 times 30 seconds, 4 times 2 minutes, 4 times 4 minutes. That's how you would set up something like an interval plan. And then what's your progression going to be? All right, so why is it important that we get these things straight? Well, there's what's called this acute chronic workload ratio. And the reason that this is interesting is that we know that we get more injuries when we progress too quickly. So the way that this is kind of visualized in a lot of sports is they take the acute workload, which is what you've done in the last 7 days, and the chronic workload, what you've done over the last 4 weeks. And you say, if I've averaged running 30 minutes 3 times a week over the last 4 weeks, and now I increase to running an hour 5 times a week over this week, now I've increased my acute exercise relative to my chronic exercise, and now the likelihood of injury is going to be higher. Okay? And what they found is that if your acute to chronic workload ratio goes up above, say, 25%, so if you're doing 25% more work this week than you did over the last 4 weeks combined, that would be an acute chronic workload ratio of greater than 25%. Say you did 75% increase, where this week you're working 75% more than you did before. The likelihood of a subsequent injury has gone up 8%. If you do twice as much work this week as you did the last 4 weeks, now your likelihood of injury has gone up 15%. And that progressively goes up. So if you are at 2.25 times, now you've looking at 20% more likely to get an injury. All right. So what this means is, if you're trying to progress, the most you want to progress is about 25% to stay in this acute chronic workload sweet spot, this low injury risk area. All right. So how'd this work? Say you're going to do running. What you would do is you would start by saying, okay, I am going to run and then walk, run and then walk, run and then walk. And because I know I can run for 30 seconds, and that's a sprint interval, it doesn't have to be a sprint where you're like killing yourself. Just go out and run. That's a sprint for your body. If you haven't done it before, go for 30 seconds. That hits that sprint interval time frame. Perfect. Then you're going to walk for, say, a minute and a half, 2 minutes, until you've recovered. Then you're going to do another 30 seconds. And you're going to do that 4 times. Just say. And then you can progress from there. And the way that you do this is you can progress intensity first, which means that now I'm going to go and I'm going to say, all right, I want to be able to cover a certain distance, and I'm going to run for 30 seconds, walk for a minute and a half, run for 30 seconds, walk for a minute and a half. And I'm going to start that, I'm going to do that 6 times, where I'm going to run 30 seconds. So I'm going to do 33 minutes of running total. And then what I'm going to do is the next thing I'm going to do that Monday, Wednesday, and Friday this week. Okay? All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back in the second week. Now I can say, okay, what I want to do is I want to progress my intensity first. So that means instead of increasing the amount of time from 6 intervals to 8 intervals or 10 intervals, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the amount of time I'm running. So I'm going to go from that 30 seconds over 2 minutes. So 30 seconds running, 1.5 minutes of walking. Now I'm going to go from 30 seconds to maybe a minute of running, a minute of walking, a minute of running, a minute of walking. So I've progressed my intensity first. And I'm going to keep doing that week to week to week until I'm going, the whole time is now running. So the third week, I'm going to be running a minute and a half and have a 30-second walk. Minute and a half, 30-second walk, minute and a half, 30-second walk. Until I can get up on that 4th week to running that full period of time. And now what I can do is I can increase the amount of time that I run for if I want. So I can increase the amount of running time that I do. And that's going to mean increasing the distance. And I can do that progressing to increase the distance or the time less than 25% per week. And then what I do is I say, okay, now what I can do is I can go again and increase the intensity, or I can come back and I can progress and I can say, okay, now what I've done is I've increased my duration. And then what I can do is at a certain point I can say, okay, now I'm still running Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Now I'm running for a little bit longer period of time. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shorten each run, but I'm going to add a new run. So now I'm going to run Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. And now I've added a 4th run, but I've shortened my other runs so that I don't increase my overall load by more than 25%. And then I come back and I say, progress my interval, and then I can continue to do this. And I can go back and I can progress my intensity a little bit. Or once I've got the number of runs I want to do per week, now I can say, okay, 1 run a week is going to be a high intensity run. And then once that I've adapted to that, now I'm going to add a second high intensity run until I get to the point where I'm reaching the goals that I want to achieve. All right, so you start nice and easy. You progress the intensity until you can hold the distance over or hold the amount of time that you're exercising. And that's what I'm doing with my swimming right now. So I went from the first time I swam, I did 10 minutes where I did 50 seconds of swimming and then 30 seconds of rest. 50 seconds of swimming, 30 seconds of rest. Now I'm up to about a minute and 15 seconds of swimming continuously. And now I can shorten my rest or keep my rest the same and just keep exercising, doing the swimming part of it a little bit longer until I get to the point where I can now swim for, say, 10 minutes. And once I can swim for the whole 10 minutes, now what I can do is I can start increasing that. From 10 minutes, I'm going to go up to 12 minutes, to 15 minutes, and then I can continue to progress so that I can progress my duration until I get to the point where now I want to add extra sessions in the week. And then I add an extra session, I shorten the duration of all of them. And I continue to do this until I get to the point where I'm reaching my goal. All right. Again, here's the summary slide that gives you all the information. Feel free to stop it here, take a look back, and let me know if there's any questions.